A federal judge is restricting some agencies and Biden administration officials from meeting and communicating with social media companies about content moderation. That decision stemmed from two Republican state attorneys general challenging the legality of the administration's efforts to curb disinformation. They claim the government went too far in trying to convince social media sites to address fake news. So what's really happening here? For more on this, we're joined by Kat Zakrzewski. She's a technology policy reporter for The Washington Post. And this is fascinating, Kat, because when you hear the headline, the Biden administration and other government officials can't contact social media companies about moderation, you feel like, well, that doesn't sound logical. But break down for us exactly what's no longer allowed and what is permitted.
So this is a sweeping injunction that will affect communications between key government agencies like the Department of Justice, the FBI, the CDC, and the social media companies. And effectively, the ruling says that these government officials are no longer allowed to talk to the social media companies about taking down certain content. And but there are certain key exceptions in this ruling. Basically, the judge made carve-outs for national security threats, voter suppression, and cybersecurity threats. And so in doing that, he attempted to address some of the concerns that the federal government raised around how such an injunction might harm American national security interests.
So it's interesting because that means then there are some appropriate carve-outs in this. But what reasoning did the judge provide for their decision?
So the judge said that the Republican state attorneys general had produced compelling evidence that the government overstepped in asking the tech companies to remove content, particularly around the COVID-19 pandemic and the elections in 2020. And, this really kind of fits into a broader accusation and narrative we've heard from Republicans for years, have argued that the tech companies have gone too far in removing content that they say represents their political views.
It's interesting because when Elon Musk took over Twitter, he also said he would tackle disinformation. Studies seem to suggest that there's been more disinformation since he reduced the level of security on the site. What are the benefits in the government's point of view is there to working with social media companies so that, as you mentioned at the top, there isn't disinformation that challenges national security?
So effectively, the programs that this lawsuit takes issue with were set up in the wake of evidence that Russian actors interfered on social media platforms during the 2016 elections, and a deadly virus, and concerns that people were using social media to spread conspiracy theories about that virus and later misinformation about vaccines. So when government officials started talking to the social media companies more frequently, it was really in an effort to address, what people viewed as existential threats to both American democracy and Americans' health. And what we're now seeing is kind of a reaction and a pushback to those efforts. You mentioned Elon Musk. A lot of Elon Musk's reasoning for taking over Twitter and his so-called free speech absolutist approach to running the company has been motivated by the concerns that the companies may have gone too far in some of their efforts to remove that type of content.
It's really fascinating. Kat, do you think or is this decision set in stone, or might there be a space down the line for this to be altered and changed?
So this is a preliminary injunction in the case, but the judge certainly indicated in his decision that he thinks that the Republican state attorneys general have provided ample evidence that suppression is going on. Now, it's very likely that we could see the Biden administration appeal this move. And this was all coming from a Trump-appointed judge, and you could see a different reaction depending if there were, a higher judge who would review this case.
Really quite fascinating. Kat Zakrzewski, thanks so much for joining us and bringing us up to date.
Thanks for having me.